What we're going to do is we're going to quickly go over the three methods that we use for determining limiting reagent, just as a quick review. Now remember, our three methods are the mole ratio method, where we compare our given mole ratio with our balanced chemical mole ratio to determine the limiting reagent. Method 2, where we compare the amount of product each reaction would produce, or method 3, where we make an intuitive guess as to which one would be limiting. So, remember, for our mole ratio method, we have to balance our equation, convert the amount of each reactant into moles, calculate a mole ratio, and then compare the actual to the balanced chemical equation. So, let's take a look at this example where I have a C6H6 reacting with bromine. And the question is, what is my theoretical yield? Well, as we know, our first step always is to write down our given. Now, because we're using our mole ratio method, we're going to convert the moles of each reactant, or the amount of each reactant, into moles. So I get my moles of each. And because my moles of bromine are lower than my moles of my C6H6, my moles of bromine will go in the bottom of my mole ratio. So my next step is to calculate my mole ratio. And I take the moles of C6H6 and divide it by the moles of bromine, and I get a 1.18 moles of my C6H6 to my moles of bromine. So this is my actual, or my given amount. I'll now take this and compare it to my balanced chemical equation, where it's a 1-to-1 ratio. Now, because the calculated mole ratio is greater than my balanced chemical mole ratio, I know that the entity on the top is excess and the entity on the bottom is limiting. So this tells me that my bromine is my limiting reagent. So now I'll use my limiting reagent to calculate my amount of product. Okay, method 2. In this method, we calculate the amount that each reactant would produce in terms of product. Okay, likewise, first thing we do, we write down like we did previously, we write out our balanced equation, we write our givens underneath. Now in this case, we have 3 reactants, and we're given the amount of each reactant. So because we have more than 2 reactants, this technique where we predict the amount that each would produce the product is probably the fastest and most appropriate. Okay, so therefore I'm going to calculate how much product would my butanol produce, and so I'll use my mass of butanol to predict my mass of my sodium hydrogen sulfate, and it's just straight stoichiometry that we did before. And then I'm going to use my sodium bromide, so I'd use my mass of my sodium bromide to calculate the mass of the sodium hydrogen sulfate. And finally, I'd use my amount of sulfuric acid to predict as well. So now that I have all these masses, I would look to see which one is the smallest, and I can see that my butanol produces the least amount. So this tells me that my butanol is my limiting reagent, and more importantly, because it's the limiting reagent, it determines the amount of product produced, so therefore my sodium hydrogen sulfate's amount would be based on the butanol amount. And therefore I'd only produce 24.6 grams of sodium hydrogen sulfate. Now we'll take a look at our third method. Remember, our third method, we're going to use what we know to make an educated guess, and then we will solve and determine if I have enough of the reactant to make the one that I'm guessing to be limiting to be consumed. Again, just like the previous 2 methods, I write out my balanced equation, and I record my given, and then I'm going to make an educated guess, and I'm going to pick one of them to be potentially limiting. Remember, there's no wrong guess, right? We made an assumption, and we're going to test the assumption. So therefore, we'll calculate a mass of aluminum required to consume all of it. And so I use my stoichiometry. I calculate that I need 7.61 grams of aluminum to consume all 30 grams of chlorine. Next, what I'll do is I'll compare my mass that I require with my mass that I have. And I see that I only require 7.61 grams, but I have 20 grams. So this tells me that because my mass that I have is greater than I required, my assumption was correct. And the chlorine is limiting because I have enough aluminum to consume all of it. Now that I know that my chlorine is limiting, I will use my amount of chlorine to predict my amount of product.